The dogs of India are conceived by tigers, for the Indians will take diverse females, and fasten them to trees, in woods where tigers abide, whereinto the greedy ravening tiger comes, and instantly devours some one or two of them, if his lust do not restrain him. And then being so filled with meat, which thing tigers seldom meet withal, presently he burns in lust, and so limes the living dogs, who are apt to conceive by him, which being performed he retires to some secret place, and in the meantime the Indians take away the dogs, of whom come these valorous dogs, which retain the stomach and courage of their father, but the shape and proportion of their mother.
Hi, I'm Alexa Sand.
And I'm Ian McInnes.
And this is Real Fantastic Beasts.
Because we believe that learning about animals in history and literature and art helps us understand our place among our fellow creatures today.
So, Ian, that is quite a lurid story. I mean, appetites of all sorts. Where does that come from? Can you tell me a little bit more about this biologically unlikely anecdote?
Well, it appears to come from a classical source, and it's gotten recycled through the Middle Ages and into a Renaissance source. So this actually comes from Topsell's Natural History of Four-Footed Animals. But he tends to repeat a lot of stories that he hears, like this one. But I picked it because a lot of the tiger lore that gets imported and recycled is very interested in sort of tiger sexuality and tiger breeding and tiger cubs. So I thought, well, this is sort of captures all of it, and also this ridiculous idea that this is how you get valorous dogs, is by breeding them with tigers.
It's so interesting because even today tigers are kind of associated with lust and with sexual desire. If you think about, any rock song from the 1970s or 80s with tiger in the title, it's definitely about the sort of conflation of appetites. She's a man-eater.
Yes. Yeah, the appetite of the tiger is, it seems to be a sort of a steady state thing, which I'm sure when we hear the medieval history of the tiger from you, that I'm sure that's going to be a part of it.
Oh, for sure. So in the European Middle Ages, tigers were really more in the category of fantastic than real beasts. That is to say, nobody in Europe was likely to have seen one. Unlike lions and bears and ostriches and camels, they weren't animals that were kept in captivity, that were imported and given as royal gifts. So when you look at the sort of inventories of medieval menageries, tigers never figure among the beasts. However, they did know of their existence. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is, like, you and I think of a tiger. We watched Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom when we were kids. We know what a tiger looks like. It's a tawny animal, orangey, striped with black, and maybe has some white around the face and the belly. And sometimes tigers can be other colors, like white with black stripes, or there are even black tigers, and there's this very rare kind of tiger called a golden tabby or strawberry tiger that's sort of like light gold with dark gold stripes. They're really pretty. They're also extremely rare. They're all the same species, actually, but they're just sort of color variants.
But always striped.
Always striped. One thing you never see in the wild is a blue tiger with spots. And yet, every time you see a medieval illustration of a tiger, that's what it looks like. It's blue with spots. So why did they think that? Where's that coming from? Because even the literary sources, as you already pointed out, that they had in the Middle Ages, the classical sources, where people had actually traveled to the Indian subcontinent or Central Asia, where there was actually a viable population of tigers at the time. And they had actually seen tigers, right? And so these eyewitness reports would get sort of filtered back to Greek and Roman writers. There's a 3rd century account by a guy named Linnaeus in his collection of miraculous things that he describes a tiger as tawny with black stripes. So those were the kinds of literary sources that were available in the Middle Ages. However, in the 7th century, Isidore of Seville, who was a church father, a wise, learned man, for reasons we don't exactly understand, describes the tiger as a spotted creature. And he kind of does this in passing, so we don't know where he got that idea. My theory is that he could have seen a different kind of animal, a leopard, because those actually were kept in a few medieval menageries around the Mediterranean.
And they have spots.
And they have spots. So I think he was a little maybe misled. Maybe he had seen or knew somebody who had seen a leopard, and so, it's an easy mistake to make if you've never seen either.
But why is it that they were not, I mean, they kept so many animals. Why are tigers not making it into the menageries of the West?
Well, there are probably a number of reasons for that, not least that tigers are, in fact, very ferocious animals and very difficult to interact with in the wild on our terms. That is to say, anybody who is interested in tigers knows that they are not super interested in interacting with humans other than humans as just another species of prey animal. So I think that might be part of it. It's very hard to catch a tiger. And in fact, almost everything that medieval writers have to say about tigers has to do with catching tigers and how hard it is. And this again,
Which they never would.
this again is coming from classical sources, and we have these sources that tell us, starting with Pliny the Elder in the 1st century CE, writing in his Natural History, and then the story gets repeated in various ways, including by St. Ambrose of Milan, another church father writing in the 4th century. And the story basically goes that certain emperors of Persia wanted to keep tigers in their menageries. So it's kind of associated with the exotic East, right? And in order to catch these tigers, what you had to do was find a female tiger who had a litter of young, and you had to sneak around, wait for her to go out hunting, pick up the baby tigers, put them in a sack, put them on your horse, and you need a fast horse for this, by the way. The hunter is supposed to pick up the baby tigers, put them in a sack, and then ride away as fast as he can. But he needs to have an additional piece of equipment, and that is either a reflective glass ball or a mirror. And the idea is that as he rides away, the tigress will chase him, of course, because she's intensely protective of her cubs. And so far this sounds like semi-plausible, right? The next thing that happens is when the tiger starts to catch up with the kidnapper, she can be sort of slowed down if you throw this mirror or this reflective glass ball on the ground, because she'll see her reflection in the mirror and think that it's her cubs. And it won't work for very long because she'll figure it out. But the idea is that it'll stop her enough that she won't be able to catch you. But you better have a fast boat waiting, is what you're told in these accounts.
Because they can swim too, and they'll come after you.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that struck me about this story is that recently my teenager showed me a TikTok video in which some cruel individual had placed a large mirror out in the woods where they knew a grizzly bear was hanging out. And in the video, the bear sort of walks past the mirror a few times, and then it sees the reflection in the mirror, and it goes bananas. Not because it thinks that its cub is in the mirror, but because it thinks it's another bear, and it attacks the mirror as if it were another bear. So, I mean, there's so much to unpack there, right? About animals and mirrors and recognition. But okay, so that's the story that you hear for most of the time in the Middle Ages. And one of the most interesting sort of spins on this is in a bestiary that was written by a guy named Richard de Fournival. It's called the Bestiary of Love. And Richard tells us through these sort of animal allegories about the experience of falling in love and trying to seduce his beloved. Like all of the sort of stuff he goes through in his efforts to win her. And it's really interesting because with the tiger story, he says, "When I first glimpsed my beloved, I was more taken in and incapacitated by the sight of her than a tigress is by the mirror. So he compares himself to the tigress rather than to
Right.
the hunter in this instance. I just think that's really interesting. It's sort of a critique of how vision seduces us, in, and so
Yeah.
it deals with all of that. And this
Like
is
the
very
absorption.
not really about the tiger at all, of course.
The mirror, it's interesting that it's a mirror or a glass ball because you run into these paintings where there's things on the wall that are mirrors, but they are actually totally convex, right?
Right.
So like mirrors were often like almost spherical to begin with.
Yeah.
So it's less weird, I think, to think like or a glass ball. I mean, like
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, like a couple of years ago, I was doing some research on mirror cases, these ivory mirror cases. And everywhere I was reading that they had a metal reflective surface in them, like polished metal. But the question occurred to me, like, why don't any of those exist? Like, polished metal discs are not very destructible, right? You would
yeah,
have to intentionally melt them down or whatever. And okay, maybe most of them would get lost, melted down, whatever, but all of them? There's not a single one, you know? And so I ended up talking to this archaeologist in Switzerland who has basically all the evidence that we need to know that even in the Middle Ages, mirrors were typically made of glass. So that's one of those historical misconceptions that there were no glass mirrors. And in fact, the thing about the glass ball comes from Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century. We know the Romans made glass. They were really good at it.
oh sure, Roman glass is
Yeah.
beautiful. I mean,
So
best there is.
exactly. So this glass ball, I'm imagining like not a lightweight thing, but like a rather heavy, dense, object. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting too because the association of the tiger with the East is the other piece of this, right? Like the idea that it belongs to this sort of exotic lands of the Persians. There clearly is a kind of fascination with the tiger in the Persian Islamic world. So I just want to leave you with one sort of bridge to the early modern period, which is that in the 15th century, this Persian ruler who was actually descended from Genghis Khan and also from Tamerlane was born. He was a prince, and although his birth name was not Babur or Persian for tiger, that became his name, and he's actually sort of considered the founder of the Mughal dynasty in India. So
In India,
yeah, so
right? Which is sort of where the tigers are. There were there ever so, like the place that you hear tigers are normally from, and I'm pretty sure that this comes from the Middle Ages, is Hyrcania, right? So
right,
like in the Renaissance they're always talking about Hyrcanian tigers.
right,
Well, Hyrcania is in Iran,
yeah,
Persia, right underneath the Caspian Sea.
right.
There have never been any tigers there.
Ah,
Right, like there was
no.
never there was never such a thing as an Hyrcanian
No,
tiger.
no, there was an animal known as a Caspian tiger, and in fact, those animals were still present in that region in the 18th century, and there's
Oh,
some
okay.
evidence that they didn't go extinct entirely until like the 1930s. That's a little known fact about tigers. I mean, if you think about it, they're Siberian tigers, right? And there's a long distance
Yeah,
between
right.
Siberia and the Indian subcontinent, and so animals typically have a kind of range. And in fact, all of those animals are essentially the same species, they're subspecies.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
So,
And although I think the Caspian tiger might have been a different, right? Because it's extinct.
well, yeah, they don't know very much
Yeah.
about those animals. That
Or
population
the
is extinct, I guess is a better way to say it.
or as
Yeah.
we should call it the Hyrcanian
Yes, the
tigers.
Hyrcanian tiger was
Yeah.
a subpopulation, maybe, of a subspecies. I know there are manuscript illuminations from Persia in that period that depict these. They kind of look like stripy lions to me, rather than tigers, but who knows?
The
Maybe
tigers.
the Hyrcanian tiger had a particularly impressive ruff. So tell me about these early modern tigers and what happens to these sort of medieval blue spotty animals in the Renaissance.
So I have a list of the stuff that's sort of the fantastic lore that's still around, and I wanted to see whether, like, I mean, maybe some of these are. I would bet some of these are also medieval, like the idea that tigers cover their footsteps with their tails, like that's how they sneak away, so that you don't see their tracks. Uh, that tigers hate the sound of bells.
Huh.
Uh, and then there's this one idea that they're all female, right? There's no such thing as a male tiger.
Huh.
That they make more tigers by, being impregnated by the wind, because tigers are supposed to be super
Wait, wait,
fast.
wait, wait. Getting back to your original story, though.
Yes, I
Female
know.
dogs.
Female
Are they
dogs.
being impregnated by female tigers?
No. So this is a parallel story. This is like, apparently some people say there's only female tigers. However, yeah,
Can't you see this
yeah.
argument like in a tavern scene in a Shakespeare play about like,
Of course,
whether
yeah.
like because
Female
it's
tiger,
sexy,
female.
because it has to do with like eating. I'm just imagining that Falstaff had a theory on tigers.
On tigers. Not as far as I know, but I could imagine that for sure. They're also this idea that they're innately modest, that they, and again, this contradicts the sex with random dogs theory, but that they only have sex in secret, right? Like that you'll never see them having sex because they're so innately modest. Yeah. Oh, that tigers taste like beef, apparently. This was
Huh.
a lore thing.
That's a variation on tastes like chicken, I guess.
Of course. Yeah. They're always held up as like kind of icons of cruelty or ravenousness or like shocking violence. And it's worth noticing that in the classical tradition, Dionysus, who's kind of the god of madness and kind of crazy violence and things, is often depicted as riding a tiger. Although, again, classical tigers were actually closer to the real tigers than the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some things that tie. It's interesting that it sort of ties together. There's a whole bunch of things getting tied together here. You've got the kind of the cruelty of the tiger, which, at least in the early modern period, cruelty is often gendered female. There's this
Right.
negative stereotype that women are somehow more cruel than men. So yeah, like the tiger would somehow be inherently more female to begin with, and this idea that like maybe the tigers are all female, and then all these stories about mommy tigers, right? Like it's all about the mother, like the tiger as a maternal animal, except for that story about impregnating the dogs that we started
Right.
with.
Yeah. I mean, it is
Um,
interesting too that they're both a sort of figure for maternal love, and a figure for a sort of bloodthirsty.
a very interesting combination. Like figuring out when the fantastic tiger turns into the real tiger, I have to go past my own kind of Renaissance period into still early modern, but like very late early modern period to get there. And like there's sort of two things we can use as an index, right? We could use the stripes, right? Because like medieval tigers are spotted, modern tigers are striped. Like something happens. So like when do the stripes occur? Like when do they appear? So stripes are one thing to look for, and then the other is you can use the spelling of tiger as an index as
Oh,
well,
interesting.
because you can spell it with an I or you can spell it with a Y, and both spellings are like they both go way back, right? So like there's a tiger with an I way back, and there's a tiger with a Y, right up to the late early modern period, but by and large, the closer you get to the modern tiger, right, the more you spell it with an I as opposed to the Y. So the TY tiger is antique, right? It sort of like becomes this kind of like old way of talking about the tiger. And if you use something like Google's Ngram Viewer, where it gives you kind of rough ideas about like different spellings, right, and how those work. The tiger with an I took over right around 1755.
Okay,
Right, so
so
that's when the lines cross, when the TI tiger like takes off.
huh.
And coincidentally, there's two other things that happened at that period. One is that the British basically the first like major moment where they take over India occurs in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. That's where they get Bengal, which is where most of the tigers are, after all. So that's 1757 Battle of Plassey. Suddenly, the British are like noticing modern tigers. The other is 1758, which is where we get the first modern scientific description by Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, right? Is like has a description of the tiger as well. So like That's that period there. The stripes are interesting as well. So they really appear first in Linnaeus. So he's writing in Latin and he uses a word which does mean stripes, I guess. But the actual word stripe for tiger doesn't really appear until the 19th century. You get what you first get is that like tigers have first they have spots and then they have streaks or bars of color, right? So you're not going to find striped tigers until into the 1800s when it becomes so conventional that I think if I asked you like what's the first word that comes into your head when I say tiger, you'll say
Yeah,
stripes.
exactly,
Right?
exactly.
And they're like, well, that's not a thing, right, until pretty late, even though they're clearly recognizing, like the Bengal tiger with the bars and the streaks at the time. There is a lot of confusion. The word tiger gets employed to describe a bunch of critters, including things that we think are leopards and panthers, even though they also had panther and leopard. And so you get writers saying, well, there's leopards and panthers, and then there's spotted tigers, and you can know, they're different for these reasons, or this tiger is spotted, but it's not like the other the other tigers. So there's a lot of kind of confusion about like what they even think a tiger sort of really is.
Huh.
And when they finally decide that the Bengal tiger is the tiger, they don't even say now it's the tiger. There's nothing else. They start by calling it the royal tiger.
Uh-huh.
Right? So there's a lot of tigers. The one with stripes is the royal tiger,
Okay.
which becomes the Bengal tiger or the tiger royal, right? So
Right,
you like
right.
hear and it feels like a special kind of tiger. It has stripes, and then they realize there is no other kind of tiger. This is the tiger.
Yeah.
This is all there is. So it happens really, really late, and it happens pretty quickly. One way to figure out, like, kind of when it's going to enter popular culture is by figuring out, in English, for instance, when they were kept at the Tower of London, because the Tower of London has this famous menagerie. They had lions at the Tower of London for like ages, right? So like when you said people know what lions look like, they know what bears look like. Certainly, Shakespeare's London, you could see a lion, you could see bears all the time.
Right.
You couldn't see a tiger, but at a certain point, the menagerie at the Tower of London gets a tiger. So like, when does that actually happen? And I don't have an actual date, but I have a before, like I have a period in which it has to happen.
Okay.
In 1741, there's a visit to the tigers in the Tower of London, he's using the term tigers, okay? And then he says, well, the two old tigers, who are named Will and Phyllis,
Huh.
are marked with brown spots like the leopard.
Huh.
Whereas those found in the East Indies are streaked all down their sides instead of having spots. So, 1741, he's recognizing that there is this tiger with stripes,
Huh.
but he's also saying the tigers in the Tower of London have spots, which means, like leopards, because they are, or they're jaguars, or something like that. And then 1774, there's an actual tiger in the tower, i.e., one described as having streaks.
Ian,
Or
you're not going to
stripes.
like this because this is like
Yeah.
me being a French art scholar and you being in the English world.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure that Louis XIV had a tiger in his menagerie at Versailles because there's a very famous story about how the Persian ambassador was impressed when they staged for him a fight between a tiger and an elephant. Now, unfortunately, that description doesn't include whether the tiger had stripes or not.
So, or spots. I'm sure it had spots.
but but the story goes, at least, that Colbert, his minister, had like as part of his dossier, his portfolio of things that he was responsible for was getting these like super exotic animals and collecting them to the court. It was a famous entertainment of the 17th century in France.
Well, I mean, like it's hard to know because they'll use tiger all over the place,
Right,
right?
right.
Like when they're clearly not talking about the striped tiger.
Right.
And if it's super famous, I mean, tiger stripes are pretty distinctive. I
Yeah.
mean, like you see you don't say like, oh, it just looks like a leopard. right?
Right,
So,
but
I
this
mean,
was the Persian ambassador. I mean, I'm assuming that he had seen a tiger, right? Because the Persian emperors kept.
well, yes, that's true. But again, like which tiger are we talking about here, right? Because tiger was a catch-all term for large cats
Yeah, this
that weren't lions.
seems to be the problem at the
Could be anything, right? Until you actually hear them saying, no,
stripes.
no, it doesn't have spots, it has
Right,
stripes.
right.
Yeah. Oh, so Linnaeus, the description of Linnaeus of the tiger, which is this is the first quote unquote scientific description of the tiger. That Linnaeus's description itself conjures up some of this past stuff. Okay, so a tiger has a long tail, a body marked all over with stripes, as big as a lion. So far, so good. And then he says it is the most beautiful and fastest animal, and it eats humans, especially Indians. And then the male tigers kill their own children. Okay, so like embedded in that is this idea that it is the most beautiful and fastest animal, which is something from the early modern lore, like tiger lore. And then this idea that it is somehow particularly ferocious and dangerous to humans is that's also something that really kind of harkens back to the past. And you get this kind of repeated as well, right? So like the idea that the tiger is most beautiful, but also most cruel and horrifying. That's something that you see like over and over again. So Goldsmith, you may know Goldsmith, has a little. He has a. This is 18th century, right? So like he's clearly talking about a modern tiger, but he's talking about it in ways that conjure up this kind of medieval tiger lore. He says that tigers partake of all the noxious qualities of the lion without sharing any of his good ones. To pride, courage, and strength, the lion joins greatness, clemency, and generosity, but the tiger is fierce without provocation and cruel without necessity. And then later, he goes on about how beautiful the tiger is, and then he says, unhappily, this animal's disposition is as mischievous as its form is admirable, as if Providence was willing to show the small value of beauty by bestowing it upon the most noxious of quadrupeds. That double, like, oh, it's fast and beautiful, but it's also like just a terrible animal. It's
Yeah.
just terrible in all sorts of ways. Do you know Blake's poem, The Tiger?
Yes, yes. Tiger, tiger, burning bright.
Tiger, Tiger. Which, by the way, he spells with a Y, so
Yeah, I
he's
remember that.
clearly hearkening. It's like that kind of antique nature to the tiger. But that poem plays into this idea that the tiger is both sort of beautiful and terrible, which for a lot of 18th century writers was just like a problem, or b that idea that Providence is showing the small value of beauty, right, by giving beauty to this horrible animal. Blake, of course, is saying no, the beauty of the tiger and its ferocity like are two like necessary poles that go together, right? His tiger poem is basically challenging like all the tiger lore that ever was,
Right.
and including the real tiger. His tiger at the bottom of the page has stripes, but it's kind of muddy, depending on which reproduction you're looking at. It's unclear as to how stripy it really was, but it's not spotted.
Yeah, I just think it's so interesting. I mean, obviously, there's a connection between colonialism and the sort of first scientific description of the tiger, and this sort of grappling with the idea of the tiger as both beautiful and incredibly deadly and fierce. And I feel like that is still with us, of course, when we talk about tigers. They're what's called, charismatic megafauna. These like
Yeah.
large, kind of fascinating and also terrifying beasts, like sharks or lions or that sort of thing. And so they again provide a like really good tool for thinking about how beauty and terror are related. And it's interesting because that seems a long way from the medieval conception of the tiger as this kind of figure for, literally as a tiger mother, like this ferociously devoted parent, but also a creature that is far enough from human nature not to recognize what a mirror image is and to be, fooled by that mirror image, as a monkey never would be, right? At least in the medieval account. So, in some ways, though, that gendering of the tiger's ferocity is also about how to understand a kind of incomprehensible other. And then tie that to the idea that Orientalism in general associates the feminine with the East and with the exotic. And I think you start to see a bigger sort of cultural picture emerging for like the tiger. And then, of course, we can't do an episode on the tiger without thinking about the Tiger King, the recent Netflix phenomenon.
Which I have not watched. And I sort of refuse
I have to admit, I haven't either, but don't think you have to have watched it to understand that it is all about sex and violence and the sort of the allure of the exotic, and also the sort of uncomfortable, distasteful feelings that are aroused by the association of humans and these beasts in a way that seems too intimate and inappropriate. So there's a lot of transgressive stuff there.
Like fascination, revulsion.
Right.
Yeah.
So
in the colonialism, so you mentioned, the East is feminized, right?
Yeah.
In a way. But then that in the colonial world, Asia was often associated as, like that form of the East was often associated with things like cruelty and violence as well, right? In other words, but also beauty, right? So like that, they understand beauty, but they're cruel, right? Like, well, okay, so the tiger stands in for, for your view of the East.
Yeah, as opposed to, a European court where as entertainment you put an elephant and a tiger in a arena together and make them fight. I mean, that's not cruel at all.
That's not cruel at all, no. So, I mean, that's practically modern here, right? Like the thing about the tiger is that in order to get to the actual tiger, they're absent in all sorts of ways for so long, and yet present in their fantastic form.
Right.
And then when they become present as, like the real tiger, they're often treated as sort of the most fantastic of real beasts, right? Which is true today, I think, right? Like,
yeah, for sure.
Of the real animals, right? Like, which are the most fantastic? Well, people say, like, tigers are just fantastic.
Right. Well, and tigers are real animals for now, but they're desperately endangered as their sort of natural environments are being lost, and as poaching is really taking a toll on the surviving animals. So that's something to keep in mind, that some of the real animals of the 21st century may be only fantastical by the end of the century.
By the end, right.
I think we'd be telling a very different story if we approached this from a East Asian perspective in this period, or a Southeast Asian perspective, where the tiger is such a important animal in terms of royal symbolism and the sort of figuration of the power of the emperor in China, for example. And I think that might be a really interesting story to bring back a guest speaker for at some point.
Yeah, right. The tiger from the other side.
But first, we have to deal with the tiger's cousin, the Manticore,
which is the man tiger. Get it?
Yep.
Manticore, the man tiger.
I know, and a scarier, more disturbing hybrid I cannot imagine. So, next up.
Next time, the Manticore. If you enjoyed this podcast, please check out our other episodes along with notes and transcripts and some fun images at realfantasticbeasts.com.